I was going to say it's always interesting when someone invites you to speak at a themed event like this, but actually it's a bit of a pain. You know, photographers, we're a bit lazy. You know, we turn up these things and do the same talk everywhere, and when there's a theme, it kind of requires you to at least revise your slides a bit and make a few additional notes. So, but actually David's theme is a good fit for me today, except perhaps for the word new, because some of what I'm going to talk about this morning is older than some of you in the audience. That said, I will talk a bit about new work, because genuinely, I mean, there's a reason for that. Genuinely, it makes more sense if I first talk about Belfast, my own city, and then say something about other cities that I've experienced, and of course translated through photography. I'll also say something about experience. David's just talked about that, and authorship, subjectivity, before talking about some work I've made outside of Northern Ireland. And as Liz said, I'm probably known best for works that could be described as post-conflict landscapes that deal with themes like memory, identity, place, landscape production. And it's probably not unreasonable to suggest that my interests are bound together by one common theme, and that would be the city. That the city, in all of the projects and the landscape of the city is a constant. So in all of the work I'll discuss this morning, I'm not actually going to talk about Afghanistan, which might be the one exception. The city is a kind of a unifying theme. However, I will say that the city itself is never the subject, and that's quite important. So hopefully the works I've chosen to talk about this morning will engage enough with the themes of the symposium. They're certainly going to acknowledge that wars are fought over both real and imagined spaces, that boundaries are erected against the other, that landscapes are created out of division and disenfranchisement, and communities, including my own, are displaced and dislocated. And the photography is a really useful, and art practice in general is a very useful tool to interrogate those very complex themes. The construction of space and place, politics and power, all fundamental components of space. And as very importantly for me is the relationship between visibility and invisibility. And I guess that is the final connecting thread that runs through every photograph I make, I suppose. So my work encompasses a number of those interconnecting themes. There's also stuff about borders, of course, and cultural and ideological borders. And I've, as Liz said, made work in Northern Ireland, of course, Europe, Afghanistan, Africa, North America more recently. And I think nearly always through landscape, and even when I'm photographing people, I'm kind of photographing them as a landscape. So with the pressure of Professor Chandler's new photographic encounters title upon me, I'll try to dispatch as quickly as possible the first bit of photographic contextualization, but it is important. In the summer, Colin Graham did this big book called 30 Years of Photography in Northern Ireland, a big show in Belfast. And it got me rethinking about the contexts in which I started photographing these places. And in the book, Colin makes a very important and original observation, that although photographers' response to the media representation of the Northern Irish conflict is the most often cited driver for the expansion of photographic vocabulary in Northern Ireland, it's certainly what I have often talked about in relation to my own work, that I have made work in response to the media representation of the conflict. And it's kind of the easy rationale for the kind of work that I make. But he suggests that it's probably only partially relevant. And it kind of got me thinking. He suggests that it's perhaps equally, if not more important, to acknowledge the role that new forms of documentary practice in contemporary photography in the late 80s, and Liz has already alluded to that, had on emerging photographers. In a creative camera interview with Paul Graham in 1986, probably before some of you were born, he spoke about a number of things. He spoke about American documentary, he spoke about new colour photography in Britain. He uncharacteristically for Paul talked about cameras and about how medium format rangefinders were instrumental in creating the work that he and people like Martin Parr and Peter Fraser were producing at that time. Very importantly suggested that the future for the stylishly exhaustive practice of documentary lay in what he called the new area of subjective documentary. And that moment for documentary photography in the mid-1980s is enormously significant, not only because it's a threshold moment for photographic practice in general, but I think because the key proponents of it were teaching in British art schools at that time, and therefore had a very, very influential effect on the emergence of that as a body of work. And it wasn't until 1991 that MoMA in New York recognised that New British Documentary Photography was contributing something significant to that debate, and Susan Kismarik's landmark show of British photography in the Thatcher years. And the press release for that focused on the photographer's subject, more particularly the photographer's relationship to their subject, and proposed that the 5 photographers were directed by individual intuitions about complex social problems, and went on to say that while other earlier British documentarians photographed the other, or those outside their social class, and generally of a station less fortunate than theirs, that these photographers embraced what's closest to them, and their work reflects an affection for their country that's unflinching in its description of the country's most extreme ills and the complex manifestations of economic change that are restructuring its society. And the word intuitive actually is used more than once. So that's the backdrop. I mean, I had just started school, primary school, when what's euphemistically called the Troubles erupted in Northern Ireland. We lived in one of those small red brick terraced houses that characterised the city at that time. And you know, I guess my memories of that time aren't unlike yours. I remember my first school, my first teacher, my first school photograph. But 1 year after starting school, in the autumn of 1970, everything changed for me and for hundreds of other families living in Belfast. And as Catholics and Protestants rioted, and the British Army arrived in Northern Ireland to try and keep the peace and provide security, before long they too were embroiled, of course, in the whole civil conflict. And as the city kind of imploded on itself, ordinary streets became literally war zones, and normality collapsed. And I remember vigilantes at the bottom of our street in masks, and 1 minute you're being stopped by the police, next minute you're being stopped by guys in masks. It was a strange, strange time, and it went on right through the 1970s, through my primary years. But most crucially, people started abandoning their homes, including us. So I only got 1 year in my first school before we had to abandon our home. And I just want to read very briefly from a community relations report at the time, 1971, that says, to give up a home where one's lived for years, and which itself is a symbol of security, for the insecurity of squatting, which many did, is an act of desperation. To then damage one's home on leaving, or allow others to do so, is an act of despair. Each of the statistics recorded in this report represents an individual tragedy and a personal bitterness which remains as a legacy of what has taken place. New residential patterns revealed by this study, which are still being reinforced by the movement of population, are obviously going to affect significantly the future development in the city. The major movement out of the Ardoyne area was Protestant families from the burnt out streets of Farrington Gardens and Cranbrook Gardens, and the majority of those went to the Ballysilm estates, including Silverstream and Tynedale. And it was to Ballysilm that we moved, and where I then grew up in a Protestant estate in the north of the city, had little or no contact with anyone from the other community until I left Northern Ireland for Farnham, as Liz said in her introduction. Previously, areas had been mixed, served as buffer zones between overtly segregated communities, and that would have guaranteed some stability in the past. And in just 1 year, the widespread displacement of communities into de facto segregated ghettos had challenged and changed the landscape of Belfast in a way that would have violent implications over the next 30 years, of course, and would provide a context for much of the photographic work that I've made. I was a student in 1985 when I made my first landscape photographs back in Northern Ireland. I was taking a class in documentary that was run by Paul Graham, a class where he proposed that there was something in between Sarkovsky's dialectic vision of photography as either a window on the world or a mirror on the self, and that he proposed in his show and book Mirrors and Windows. And my photographs were this kind of naive attempt to use photography and autobiography to respond to the crisis of representation felt by documentary photographers at that time. So these first encounters with place are not just subjective encounters, but they're very individual. They're about my personal experience, but hopefully that then can open up wider things that people can encounter through my experience. And they're produced as photographs in the hope that through my personal encounter there could be the potential to engage with issues that were affecting the lives of others. So you'll see this morning a recurrence of methods as I go through various bodies of work. Maps are important, certain types of place in the city, of course. The framework that I set for each project during the search phase is also key and rigidly adhered to. And in this person, it's weirdly showing second year BA work, this work. But it's important to show it, I think, to provide some context. What I did here is I revisited sites around the city that I had described in diary entries that I'd made when I was 15. And you get this very personal narrative played out 15 years later, played out in and on the landscapes that then give some kind of shape, some form to the memories from the diary. So the idea is that the construction of memory, my recording of mundane daily events and my kind of reductive, naive teenage account of the political events at the time kind of takes shape in the photographic description of the place. So here, went down to my friend's house after church. We went to see my granny's house on the left. Got the Donegal Road bus home. The next hunger striker is deteriorating, and the election polls, spelled wrong, start on Wednesday. So mixed together with just the ordinary was this kind of strange political commentary. So looking back now, it's no surprise, I guess, that I have always saw the landscape of the city as this kind of contested and problematic place, a site of dispute, a debatable space, I've also called it before. Here's an example where this barbershop I went to was the best barber in Belfast. It was the only place to go, but you shouldn't have gone there if you're in a Protestant school uniform. So my mum went crazy when she found out I got my hair cut on Castle Street. And that's what I've written about in my diary. And the last example, that when they buried Bobby Sands, all of Belfast ground to a halt that day, the first hunger striker to die. But I was the youth club, our youth club, just as normal, taking apart a Rubik cube and putting it back together again to try and impress. So it's that kind of the reality of life going on despite the kind of cataclysmic things that were going on at the same time. I'll just skip that one. So there are often no people in my photographs. There may be sometimes fragments of people, and that's because I'm trying to allow the human figure to resonate through those fragments, and particularly through objects. Objects are important, and how I retrieve objects from the landscape with the camera. In Inside Information, I hope, it is the next slide, and David was involved with this show back in the 1990s, but in Inside Information, that book brought together 3 bodies of Northern Irish work that I'd made in the late 80s and early 90s. And in it, Irish poet Kieran Carson writes this piece. It's called Intelligence, and it's published alongside the photographs I'd made of the interiors of police stations. And Carson uses these sparse words, and they're peppered with objects. I'll just read you a short bit. Bread vans, milk carts, telegraph poles, paving stones, lime trees, chestnuts, hawthorns, buses, tires, prams, shopping trolleys, municipal waste bins, milk churns, ladders, taxis, hoardings, lampposts, gas cylinders, scaffolding, orange crates, fences, weighing machines, earth. All of them just everyday items, but items that form a vocabulary of the contested landscape, because all of those things within this contested landscape become something other than themselves. And Carson's prose, I think, mirrors the forensic examinations of photographs that I made. So literally, here's a gas cylinder, he refers to gas cylinder, and this is a photograph of a gas cylinder that's been turned into a mortar bomb, photographed in they've been seized by the police at that time. So, what I'm trying to do is, with this kind of close observation, is to attempt to kind of unlock in the fabric of the city and these spaces, these complex narratives of power, surveillance, where otherwise neutral objects are transformed, sometimes literally like the gas tank, I guess, but transformed by photography. And that the battered, brutalized spaces of these police stations then are presented as metaphors for the political situation. They're not photographs of, the meaning in these pictures, and what I'm trying to construct in terms of the meaning in these pictures is not about describing the actual places. So I'm often asked, what is that room? What's it for? That's absolutely irrelevant. I used it for something else. I used it so it would, I could present it as a kind of allegory of the situation. So, and that's the case with all of these, I guess, that the reading of them is not about the specific space itself. But the focus on the iconic geography of place suggests that the cultural landscape of Northern Ireland is relatively uncomplex, which it certainly is not, that it's not neatly carved up. It's just not that simple. And the complexity arises out of these multiple, quite politicised readings of landscape and the contradictory nature of spatial association, the boundaries, large amounts of space, permanently transitional. And it's in those kind of contested marginal spaces, often between communities, that I've made most of my work in Belfast. And I hope that you'll see that that then emerges in the way I've photographed other cities. You know, for those living in the city, the identification of space and place is something that's deeply experiential. It's often linked with traumatic experience, you know, where small, visually insignificant places can play a really important role in someone's memory, or the collective memory indeed of a community, and crucially can be a focus of quite opposing readings. And in that sense, Paul Graham's Troubled Land, this is one of Paul Graham's pictures from that book, I think some of those pictures express a false sense of territorial permanence, and they just become illustrative of that territorial iconography of conflict. You know, this land belongs to this community. I think the success of Paul Graham's work in Troubled Land isn't actually, I mean, I don't think it's from the painted flagstones to marking the boundaries. It's much more from the banal pictures, or the seemingly banal pictures, that are incidental rather than symbolic. And I think that's much more interesting. For they're probably closest to my own lived experience of that place, because the violence is rarely written on the landscape. It actually hums beneath the surface and is rarely audible, except in that kind of momentary shout or scream of a violent incident or a dramatic moment. So the everyday, the prosaic, that's what dominates and obscures the otherness of violence, and that's the experience of living in a city like Belfast. And so as a result, the drama of the moment, the event, is actually rarely described in the landscape. It's always implied, and therefore is always implied in the photographs I produce. And Jerry Badger writes in Troubled Land about this picture, that, you know, although the picture is called Graffiti Phone Box, it's not even really about the graffiti. It's that everything in the landscape in this picture is totemic. So the whole picture is red, white, and blue. The sky, the phone box. You know, the whole landscape becomes you can read it in that way, which I think is just lovely. So in 1985, I began making the Sectarian Murder series, and I started photographing locations that were literally around my childhood home. In fact, the first, I don't think I ever got more than a mile or two. I started at local shops where some boys from our school had been standing and were shot, 5 of them from a passing motorbike, outside the chip shop, here on waste ground behind the youth club that I photographed in the earlier series. And these on remarkable locations, these kind of scraps of waste ground, fields, abandoned playgrounds, kind of purposeless places, no significance, places that would go unnoticed by anyone, at least unnoticed until they're claimed by either those who use them for a sectarian purpose, and of course noticed by me because I re-establish their significance by the very act of photographing there. And what they do is they return us to the scene after the incident, and they're not meant to examine the disruptive aftermath of the blood-soaked earth or a body covered in a sheet. I mean, they're much later than that. You know, when the punctured surface of the landscape's been repaired, this idea that the landscape then conceals that violent moment. And then the text is taken from newspaper reports at that time, and then there's a kind of triangulation goes on, that in between, the space in between the text and the image, you imagine the violence, and that is much more powerful than describing it. So, you know, Benjamin develops that concept that the detail of most architectural environments are unmemorable. And that's particularly true with familiar landscapes that we experience daily, like the landscape we experience on our walk to work, perhaps. The detail of those spaces is kind of kept, he says, in a half-light until some dramatic event transfixes the room or the scene's image in what he calls the memory plate. And he describes using, of course, a photographic metaphor, the burning magnesium powder flash of the event burning the image indelibly on the mind. But he also suggests that the loss of memory can then be shocked or triggered by an uncanny event where the unconscious feeling or lost fragment of memory is accessed or registered in that experiential moment. good example, you know, in Proust, it's a taste of a Madeleine pastry that invigorates lost memory. And Freud, his analysis of the dreams of trauma victims from the First World War, notes that consciousness comes into being at the sight of a memory trace. So when I was making these photographs, I guess I wasn't really aware of a lot of that, but I was certainly aware of how powerful it was to be standing in the actual site or on the actual place where something terrible had happened, even though it wasn't visible in front of me. And I remember a man walking his dog stopped me and approached me and asked me why I was photographing in this scrap of land. And I remember making up some terrible story. I mean, you obviously couldn't have said to him, "Oh, I'm making a project about sectarian murder." So I think I said something like, "I'm working for the council. We're going to build a playground here," or something, you know. And he said, "I don't think so." And I kind of panicked, and he said, "This scrap of land has a history." And I said, "What kind of history?" And he said, "You know, seeing you photographing here," he said, "brings back memories of this place, because it was photographed once before by police photographers." And he said, "This place is a dumping ground for bodies." And what he was saying is there could be no other reason to photograph such a place in the city, such a known place, beyond the forensic. And that the very act of photographing such a place and to examine that, that kind of landscape that would otherwise be entirely ignored is to ignite its potential in the wider narrative of the city and, of course, of the conflict. So in 1997, so this is not chronological in any sense. So in 1997, after a long period of not making work in Northern Ireland, I went back to the city at the time of the ceasefire and returned to the idea of territory in Belfast and the borders between communities. And these borders and frontiers, I mean, they are in parts of the city formally defined by town planners. I mean, there are big walls, but also they use other strategies. They've used, since that time in the early 70s, depopulation strategies. They've redeveloped terrace streets, and they've built walls and buffer zones that use planting and trees. They use traffic redirection, all kinds of things employed as mechanisms to try and resolve long-standing geopolitical tensions between communities. But actually, for me, the really interesting thing is how local people have shaped urban space. And this is something that I talk about also in the work I've made in Africa. And the pragmatism that fuels that kind of intervention in many ways is just the same as the development of city space in other parts of the developing world, because people alter the city because they need to. And when I photographed these interface areas of Belfast, you know, I wasn't interested in the Berlin-esque peace wall down the Shankill. Much more interested in gates that have been made in local metal shops, or doors that have been bricked up so a terraced house suddenly became a wall. This kind of locally conceived, locally made, locally maintained defensive architecture kind of confounds all those theories of spatial design and planning, because it evolves out of lived experience, of living in the dysfunctional reality of the city. And people create these barriers and these walls to survive. And of course, everyday objects become fiercely energized and emblematic, and you know, gates like this resemble flags. And crucially, these photographs are all made on one side of the wall. They're made on my side of the wall. You know, the other side of these walls and fences I've never seen. And I kind of liked the idea where someone said to me, "Well, why did you not photograph the other side?" And I remember saying, well, because I would never have been on the other side of those walls. So to go there as an act of photography is not relevant to my experience of those walls and of the city. It makes no sense for me to trespass just through the act of photography. Does that give me license to do that? I think not. So I chose not to do that. And there are still 41 different walls dividing communities in Belfast. And of course, they're not just walls built of brick and steel. They're built from political policy and alternative versions of history and latent prejudice and different education, media reporting. And this project, Conflicting Account, tries to give some form to that division of understanding, and particularly the separate reading of recent history that's reshaped the identity of the two communities and constructed seemingly unassailable walls in their collective psyche. So this works in response to the opening pages of a great book by Graham Dawson called Making Peace with the Past, Memory, Trauma and the Irish. I don't think it's any accident that he uses the word terrain to refer to conflicting readings and understandings of the Irish past, and he says that the conflicted terrain of the Irish past is occupied by two powerful grand narratives, one loyalist and one Protestant, the other nationalist and Catholic. And that there's no pure form of these competing stories which exist only in the range of their tellings and retellings, with numerous variations and different emphasis and nuance across a variety of modes of media and representation. So this project draws together ideas of territory, contested readings of landscape and place that I've dealt with in the earlier work, and the equally contested terrain of language and history and the culturally peculiar, and the often opposing readings of texts. So the cultural, ideological and historical slippage that occurs around certain ideas and words and dates is exploited in the work. So here, where words have been erased in the landscape, so these would have had slogans of some kind which have been wiped out. And this idea that there can never be a correct reading of an image or indeed an event or a historical telling of it. This is called masked, and you can just see a masked mural there in the distance. So there's this this idea that I also am editing the image, that by making the frame so occluded, so tight, by abstracting both the landscape and the things I've photographed, that I also am consciously editing, which is of course what's going on all the time in terms of how meaning is constructed around these situations. So the fragments of text have been recovered from history classrooms in schools, both Protestant Catholic schools in the area where I was commissioned to go and do this in Portadown, as well as these texts and erased texts on walls and housing estates and roadside memorials. And the idea is that they open a dialogue with the situation that can never be or will never be described inside the image. So it's not described there, and not my image. And they ask whose memory, which volunteer, which history, whose victim, and that ambiguity in these visual fragments is very purposeful. And visual fragments then that function as metaphors for the layering of narrative, the writing, erasing and rewriting of history, and the conflicting rhetoric of the two traditions. And place is identified in these kind of tenuous and abstract ways that are nonetheless then understood by the communities that inhabit them. And of course the past is everywhere in the city. In fact, these are two hunger strikers. And there's an emerging tension between a desire to escape the past without giving in the complete amnesia, I suppose, because that would just maybe return us back to the 70s and 80s. But so how does a city like Belfast maintain its contested past without openly memorialising something that was abhorrent to one community or another? And it's been said that memory is both burden and liberation, an uneasy dialectic of remembering and forgetting, and that is so true. So over the years, I've made a kind of steady retreat from the kind of explicit extremities of sectarian murder work and the texts, for example, to this more detached, generic exploration of the impact of conflict and traumatic incidents and the tension of peripheral environments. So by developing the interest I have in the phenomenology of landscape, particularly related to the absence of the human figure, and absence is a really deep-seated aspect of photography, of phenomenology of photography, and it's a very important one in my own work. In Rotterdam, I made this series of photographs called The Missing, and in that series I present the city in fragments. The idea is to represent those who not only go missing from society, but who stay missing, who deliberately jettison their identity, and where do they disappear to, and how can photography represent them when they're actually absent? They exist in this kind of non-place, slipping out of sight. They live in those parts of the city that are invisible to most of us. They occupy no man's land, under bridges, peripheral spaces, beneath motorways, in service shafts, hostels, abandoned buildings, squats. And the idea is that the photographs then present a picture of this world, this other city, and in doing so they present a picture of the missing. And so the landscape is also photographed inside the hostels in its kind of representation. And it's something that I've extended then. I mean, after this project, my interest in these kind of spaces extended to other cities. It's a bird from a Salvation Army shelter. Let me just get to the next. Yeah, so I lived in Paris for 6 months. I did a visiting professorship at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1996. And when I was there, I became interested in the Terrain Vague. Ajay, between 1910 and 13, he photographed these earth embankments that surrounded the walled city of Paris. And these fortifications were neither town nor country. They were these kind of vague, marginal spaces that had no clear purpose, and beyond them were the things the city wanted to keep out of view, the abattoirs, the things it didn't want to know about, the gypsy encampments, all of that. So this banlieue, a kind of 250-metre wide strip, was particular to Paris. It became known as the Zone, a strip that had been designated as a defensive buffer where building was forbidden. But like most transitional spaces, of course, it was claimed that it was inhabited by the slaughtermen and the itinerants and the rag pickers, and indeed Ajay photographed those marginal spaces and the marginalised people that had colonised them. But in the 1970s, 1973, they built the Peripherique, the ring road around Paris, on that site. And they created then a new Terrain Vague, the one that lies at the heart of the city and of lots of cities. You know, this flyover between the road interchanges, the industrial units, the car parks, the service yards. And there's two opposing views generally that polarise discussion of these spaces. The first decries the disorder they represent in the city because they're not planned. The second, by contrast, highlights their potential interest as spaces of freedom in an urban environment that's increasingly standardised and regulated. In the first view, that the vacant, indeterminate zones that punctuate the urban landscape represent unacceptable deterioration and abandonment in the city. And the Terrain Vague then runs contrary to the desired image of a prosperous city, particularly like Paris, of course, because it punctures the ideal of plenty and order, and generally everything is associated with urban prosperity. In fact, it just presents a problem. But for those who hold the second view, which includes me, the Terrain Vague offers a counterpoint to the kind of dull, neutralised order and consumption that holds sway over so many of our cities. Because you see this creative appropriation and informal uses that would otherwise have trouble finding space in the city. So the Terrain Vague is this kind of ideal place for certain resistance to emerge, and a place to potentially open up alternative ways of experiencing the city. And it was a Terrain Vague, in fact, I was looking for when I went to Africa, and I'll come to that just in a minute. But making work in these places, I rarely encountered people, but of course I routinely stumbled across evidence of informal use. You know, people have been here, and yet you didn't have to encounter the people at all. And you know, as outsiders, we typically read cities through their buildings. And, you know, most cities want us to experience a city through its signature buildings and its sports stadium and its institutional buildings and its cultural attractions. You know, they're all presented to us as a kind of a shorthand text for the city. And we become to visualise cities through that small handful of buildings and a city's landscape assets, as they call them. You know, these spaces are just much more interesting. Koolhaas called those spaces junk space, although his concept extends way beyond the kind of transitional space. Berger calls them drawscapes, but they're the spaces that kind of the cement that hold the city together. Road intersections, railway yards, vacant building sites, industrial units, alleyways, car parks, spaces basically that are ignored and are invisible. Places where, like most of you I imagine, I go to when I arrive in a city instead of to the museum, probably where I ought to go and look at some art. So, invisible cities. Yi-Fu Tuan describes places as centres of felt value, where biological needs such as those for food, water, rest and procreation are satisfied. And that is the most stripped down description of place that I can find. And in sub-Saharan Africa is a very, very applicable description of place. One has to marvel at the innovative genius of the urban poor in how they take advantage of every opportunity just to survive and improve their living conditions wherever they find themselves in the city. And the vernacular space of these cities is born out of a straightforward pragmatism. John Reader, in the essay in my Invisible Cities book, notes that people move to cities because they imagine it might be easier to find something to eat. That simple. And that's why the world's fastest growing cities are in sub-Saharan Africa. And the use of the city space in the developing world is science that I just find fascinating because of its complexity, because nothing is fixed. Nothing is fixed. And on subsequent visits over the years, 4 years I went back and forward, I witnessed change not just in people using particular spaces, but the mix of activities, some formal, most not. You know, so here in this picture you can see everything from a woman running a washing business, to a guy burning and recycling rubbish, to a farm in the foreground. That's drug dealers over in the back left-hand corner beneath that flyover. You know, something going on everywhere. And these unplanned settlements and vernacular building on the periphery of African cities are in fact the chief instrument of city growth. And it's growth that's largely unplanned, unmapped, it's permanently transitional. In Africa, very little land is occupied with formal title, and extensive development occurs on all types of land, despite how it might have been identified in the push to nationalise and zone land since independence. And governments have tried to impose some kind of order on urban development and regulate the practices of individuals and outlaw established practices of land use and appropriation, but they've largely failed. The majority of city dwellers live in areas inadequately serviced by roads, sanitation, water, electricity, never mind cultural facilities. There are also spaces represented predominantly by photographs that define them as chaotic and that focus on the poverty at the surface of these communities. And that really was the biggest challenge. How do you define those places without resorting to or actually falling into the trap of generalised statements about disorder or overpopulation or general chaos? And that was bloody difficult. You know, I wanted to make photographs that defined African urbanity. That's what I was interested in, because I found it almost impossible to find visual material that countered that stereotypical view of the African city. And that's not to say I've been able to avoid those stereotypes completely, but I've tried to focus on the routine uses of city spaces, this idea of the colonial trace, as a backdrop to people's unobserved, unheightened, everyday interaction with city spaces and what would otherwise be unremarkable in a documentary context. Calvino wrote that the city does not tell its past, but contains it like the lines of a hand, written in the corners of the streets, the gratings of the windows, the banisters of the steps, the antennae of lightning rods, the poles of flags, every segment marked in turn with scratches and indentations. And in post-colonial Africa, history is something that's deeply inscribed on the surface of the city. Traffic lights, zebra crossings, billboards, and of course imperialist architecture, Anglican churches, embassies, city parks, statues, formal gardens. You know, they all hang, they all cast this shadow of the past over the city. And in visible cities, the statues of imperialism have been replaced by these giant, empty advertising hoardings that point to Western investment in capitalism, the promise of that, but of course they remain empty and dysfunctional and as out of place as a statue of Queen Victoria or a British general in the centre of Lusaka or Lagos. The title is taken from Calvino, and it plays with Calvino's book Invisible Cities, which asserts that what defines a city is not so much its physical structure, but the impression it imparts upon its visitors from the way its inhabitants move within it. Something, he says, unseen that hums between the cracks. And in his book Invisible Cities, Marco Polo describes these 55 mythical cities. But when he describes them, what he's really doing is really describing one city, which was his city, Venice, of course. And that's the invisible city that's inscribed in all of those cities he recounts in the book. And so in the work I've made in Wales, Italy, Paris, Rotterdam, America, Africa, I am referring back to one city, to my city, to Belfast. So what of my city might exist in others? How autobiographic can an experience in a foreign city actually be? And after Calvino, then I've tried to construct an imagined city that's then built of fragments that refer to the colonial narratives of the city. And like other works, it's kind of fragmentary, and it's these partially occluded images of the city that move between these confined claustrophobic interior spaces and the expanse of the landscape in an attempt to reflect the constructive, subjective, fragmented, and routinely contested nature of history. Another Calvino quote, he said, he needs only a glimpse, a glint of light in the fog, an overheard conversation between two passers-by, and from those fragments he will put together the perfect city, piece by piece, made of fragments mixed with the rest, of instants separated by intervals. And it's those intervals that I was looking for when I made these photographs, because people spend a lot of time waiting, just doing nothing. Like the kind of moments between conversations when nothing is occurring or nothing is happening. And I remember asking my driver one day, if you weren't driving me, Shino, what would you have done today? And he said, well, my day would be, I get up, I try to find food for the family, and then I rest. That's it. It's as pragmatic as that. So this reordering of leftover space, actually a nice quote from Malik Simone, who writes that African cities, urban dynamics are shifted away from actual cities to murky borderlands, and where new formulations of sovereignty, belonging and nationhood are previously concretized, exclusion, incorporation, marginality and experimentation converge in ways that just aren't easily discernible. You know, the electric obviously just bypasses these people. That's a bank that never got finished. Okay, so Volunteer, this book just about to come out, it'll be launched next month, it was on press last week. And it's my attempt to make work about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and their impact on North America. Liz said I went to Afghanistan in 2002 for the Imperial War Museum, and I kind of have been wanting to make a piece of work about the war without going back there. Once was enough. And specifically, well, I thought long and hard about how to do that, and decided actually that military recruitment could be a very interesting mechanism to examine the North American city, but also to examine the conflict and the impact of the conflict on society there. Since the draft was discontinued in 1973, all branches of the US military have relied entirely on volunteers to fill their ranks. Volunteers, I put in inverted commas. There's constant challenges in maintaining a balanced supply of recruits for the Army, but 3 decades of experience confirms that the voluntary policy works well. But research shows that a disproportionate number of the poor and members of minority groups make up the enlisted ranks of the military. And while most privileged Americans are underrepresented or absent, and that's something that's talked about a lot. So the counties with the highest recruiting rates you'll see there against the population average come from rural communities or small towns and rural communities. And as sustained combat in Iraq made it harder than ever to fill the ranks of the all-volunteer force over the last 10 years, the government in America changed laws so recruiters could recruit people more aggressively. They changed the law, for example, so that a school could no longer protect the students' records. So the counties with the highest recruiting rates you'll see there against the population average come from rural communities or small towns and rural communities. And as sustained combat in Iraq made it harder than ever to fill the ranks of the all-volunteer force over the last 10 years, the government in America changed laws so recruiters could recruit people more aggressively. They changed the law, for example, so that a school could no longer protect the students' records. So a recruiter can go to a school and say, can you show me the records of your highest failing students? And therefore they target them as recruiters. Quite extraordinary. Many of today's recruits are financially strapped, with nearly half coming from lower middle class to poor households, and according to the Pentagon data based in zip codes, nearly 2/3 of Army recruits came from counties in which a median household income was below the poverty line. So I basically went to these cities. I visited over 500 recruitment offices in 15 states. All the locations are predetermined. I would go to, here's Tulsa, and here's the recruiting centres around Tulsa. I'd go to each location, quite frustrating sometimes, because I remember Oklahoma, I was very excited. I got to Oklahoma City thinking 13 recruitment centres. This is going to be a rich picking. And I didn't come away with a single picture. Because you have to make it where the recruitment centre is located, and it just wasn't interesting. So that was an incredibly difficult challenge, really. So the research is all done ahead of time. Of course, you know where you're going. I would go to America for a month at a time, and then just exhaustively go and visit these places. The landscapes are, again, largely unpeopled. It's also a landscape that echoes the war, but of course, instead of the harsh light and the ochre tones of the desert, you get these kind of grey tones of the... I'm suggesting that I'm showing a different theatre of operations, that the war is a theatre, but also home and recruitment is a different fight, it's a different battle where there's a battle to recruit new soldiers. They tend to be located, as you saw from that map, on the margins of the contemporary city, and they're amongst thrift stores and fast food outlets, nightclubs, gun stores. When I would see a dollar store or a strip club, I'd know I was coming close to the recruitment centre. That was kind of a pattern. And of course, for those dwelling on the periphery of these places, the significance of of signing up is just too great to describe. And I just wonder, do they ever really think about it? I mean, that previous picture, these are Mexican workers in Texas who are waiting to hoping to be picked up to go and work on a building site. Now, right behind me are 3 shops. There's a 7-Eleven, I think there's a laundrette and the recruiting office. And you've got to stand there and think, at what point do they cross the road? Because if they cross the road, they get a signing-on bonus of $12,000. They get medical care for their whole family. But at that time, they would have been in Afghanistan in 6 weeks. 6 weeks for on-the-job training, as they call it. So the strategy was difficult because sometimes the office itself is very boring, and of course the idea is it's where they're located is interesting, not the office itself. Although that's the recruitment office on the top floor of that building, above the step-up lounge. Here there's a recruit, and this brick building opposite is a federal building, so the FBI are in there. The 4 branches of the military all have recruiting offices in that building, and that's a young recruit crossing the road. So I'm photographing often in the car park or the back of the building, or this is the back of a Marine recruiting office in San Diego. Pork steak, I like that picture. So of course they're with low value shops. That tends to be the pattern of these. And the title of this is Oil. Obviously, I mean, it has this kind of idea of the IED and stuff going on in that picture. Let me have to describe that. And closed down fast food place next to a big National Guard recruiting centre. It's the back door of the recruiting centre in Alabama. So you get the gist, I hope. There's a really interesting interview I found by a young guy, Albert Deal. He lived in a place like this, which is basically a caravan park. And across the road's a Walmart, and next to the Walmart's a recruitment centre. Albert Deal, 25, he hasn't worked for 2 years, lost his job in the local factory, the only employer in the town, and he said the job market's dwindling and it's hard for a young man or woman to find something other than working in the fast food business. He said, I have tried anything and everything to land a job ticking off glass and furniture companies, a local telemarketing firm, even McDonald's, and no one ever called me back. He's divorced, the father of a 3-year-old son, and just gave up trying to find a job and decided to call the recruiter because he said there's just nothing else. So it's a terrible story, and but of course is also the byproduct of the project is the city and the American city. And the American city, once you get away from the East Coast and the West Coast, and what I said about the idea of iconic buildings representing the city, the middle of America is this kind of banal, bland, achingly prosaic landscape. And of course that's not the representation that any of us will be particularly familiar with. So that's the front of that building is a Blockbuster, and the back of it's a recruitment centre. That's a pink container in a car park in Los Angeles, and they just lift it and move it somewhere else afterwards. Okay, and actually that's the back of the book, which is a really perfect segue into the most recent work I'm working on. I'll finish with this body of work, and it's a project called The List. So this photograph is actually just taken from the car park of the recruiting centre looking at the houses, but this next project is very much, it's also about the North American city, but it's about houses. It's called The List, and it uses another subject through which to represent the city. State sex offender registration and notification programs are designed to make publicly available via the internet information about offenders who have been convicted of a criminal offence against a victim who's a minor or a sexually violent offence, more specifically information about persons convicted of offences involving sexual molestation or sexual exploitation of children, and persons convicted of rape and rape-like offences. Sorry, it's a quote. And each state has its own specific laws that address these crimes, and the length of prison sentence, and then they have these residency laws that restrict where in a city a released offender may live. So that's an online map of offenders living in the city of Chicago. Now that looks crazy, but actually the city of Chicago has relatively few sex offenders in relation to the size of population, because it's a city of millions. I think it has less than 1,000 sex offenders living in it, but if you go to upstate, this isn't actually it, but if you go upstate to a town like Muskegon, which would probably be about the size of Taunton, you have almost as many sex offenders as live in Chicago. The reason for that is that varying local laws create this kind of emergence of offender clusters. So one county maybe enforces strict residency restrictions and another doesn't, and it creates offender clustering. So in a small town, quite often the restrictions on where you can live are not so strict. So typically these spatial restriction zones are defined by distance criterion. So you can't live maybe 500 feet from what they call a sensitive facility, which could be a church, bus stop, school, playground, community centre, public swimming pool, the long, long list. So if you live in a city, it's almost impossible to live more than 500 yards from all of those things. And in fact, you can do some GIS research to show that there's only these tiny wee pockets left, and then once you live there, there's not more than 2 offenders can live in the same place. So what happens is it pushes them out of the city into these rural locations. So I kind of looked at these small cities along the American Rust Belt, that stretch from Detroit to South Dakota, and the 4 states photographed have the highest concentration of offenders. So that's a Google Street picture of an offender's house. That's where I started, Google Street. So you're able to kind of have a look and see the actual houses before you even go there. And the effects of these residence restrictions on offenders and communities are really significant. Now, crucially, to go back to this thing of visible and invisible, these offenders are living in the community in plain view, but they're also completely invisible. Because if you live in a community, you just don't want to know. You speak to people, I mean, you do and you don't. Because once you open the door and have a look, I mean, my word, my very first day on this project, I arrived in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I got up in the morning and I set my GPS on the car for the first number of locations, and 12 of them were in the same street. 12 in the same street. A long street, maybe a mile long street, but 12 of them. So that is the kind of nature of this project. So these are the homes, these are their homes, it's where they're living. And it, like lots of the work before, acknowledges the hidden nature of these difficult issues in society. And you know, every city has this element of willful amnesia, I suppose, and concealed stories and histories and events that people don't want to commemorate or they don't want to confront, and they're all present on the edges of the city's consciousness, and yet they're absent, and they're hidden away, and yet they're impossible to erase. They're beneath the surface normality of, and beneath that surface normality of kind of vernacular architecture is something that nobody wants to talk about. It's a bit of a conversation stopper for me. So I'm at a dinner party and people say, what are you working on? I'm afraid that conversation about sex offenders doesn't really go down too well. Because actually, they are the new pariah. So this is not, and I'm sure you realise that the work I make is never an overt critique of any of these things. I'm not taking a position. And actually, it's as problematic for them as it is for the communities. It is an absolute conundrum. They need to live somewhere. But of course the motto would be, if it were you, not on my doorstep. A woman came out of her house, I was photographing the house next door, a guy who was living in that house who has been convicted twice, both for raping girls under the age of 8 years old, living in that house. And she came across the road to me, she was brushing her driveway, and she said to me, what are you photographing? And God, again, you know, you can't say I'm photographing that sex offender's house who lives next door to you. So there was an area of land next to the house where a house had been demolished, and I said, I'm photographing that empty plot. He says, oh, are you thinking of buying? Are you thinking of building a house? And I said, yes. And I realised I'm digging a hole here that I'm not going to be able to get out of. And she said, I said, has it been empty for long? Trying to prolong the conversation. And she said, yes, about 2 years. And then she said to me, have you got children? And I said, yes, I have 3 children. She said, this isn't a good place for children. And I said, right, why not? She said, well, there's only 2 of us left who own our houses. They're all rental houses. And she said, did you see the house at the end of the street? And that house was a the kind of house I haven't included in the project, which is almost like a hobo's house, you know, everything piled in the garden in the driveway. And he was also a sex offender, and I photographed it first. And she said, "Do you see the house at the end of the street?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, you know, that's symptomatic. But if you've got children, this isn't a good place." And that's all she said. But I mean, it's so that she still didn't feel that she could say it, that it still had to remain unsaid, was very, very interesting, I think, and very telling. So, I guess what tends to happen with these clusters is that they end up living in the worst housing, in the poorest housing. A landlord finds out that he has a sex offender, and suddenly his address is registered on the internet. You've maybe got a year before you've got to go somewhere else. It's a kind of constant cycle. There's also middle class offenders, of course, but they tend to be in locations near adult video stores and tattoo parlours and strip clubs, you know. And they are truly the contemporary dislocated and displaced, albeit as a consequence of their own crimes, of course, but they exist in plain view, yet they're hidden on the edge of the city's consciousness, because of course it's too problematic to acknowledge, but equally it's too difficult to ignore. I'm done. That's me. I'm just going to show the last pictures. I've said my last words. I'm just going to show you a few pics. This is unedited, so I just bunged the whole load in for you. That's it. Thank you very much.